There is a quality to the silence on the Giza Plateau after the sun has fallen below the horizon. The heat of the day bleeds out from the stone, and the air grows thin and cool. The sounds of the city recede, replaced by a low, persistent wind that seems to carry no message, only the fine dust of ages. It is in this quiet that the monuments cease to be destinations and become presences. They do not speak, but they hold a weight that presses on the mind, a gravity that pulls thought downward, into the bedrock itself. It is a place that feels less like a ruin and more like a waiting room, where the interval between then and now has been suspended, and the past is not gone, but merely dormant, breathing slowly in the dark. We are taught to look up at these structures, to measure their scale against the sky. But the first question, the one that unsettles the foundation of the accepted story, does not begin with the pyramids. It begins much lower, with the ground itself. We turn our attention away from the colossal pyramids and toward the strange, basin-like depression carved from the living rock of the plateau. Here, the Great Sphinx rests, not upon the landscape, but within it. For millennia, it has been the silent witness, the guardian of a forgotten threshold. But it is not the creature itself that holds the first key. It is the stone walls of its enclosure, the sheer limestone cliffs from which its body was freed. These walls are a document, older and perhaps more honest than any papyrus. They have been exposed to the elements for a very long time, and like any surface left to the mercy of the sky, they have recorded the climate they have endured. One does not need to be a geologist to see it, only an observer willing to trace the lines that time has left behind. The story they tell is simple, direct, and deeply unsettling. The evidence is carved into the rock in plain sight. Running from top to bottom are deep, vertical fissures, undulating channels that speak not of wind, but of water. They are the unmistakable signatures of prolonged and heavy rainfall, of torrents cascading over the edges of the enclosure and scouring the soft limestone for centuries, perhaps millennia. This is not the work of sand blown by the desert wind, which leaves horizontal, abrasive scoring, a pattern visible on every other dynastic structure on the plateau. Here, the pattern is fundamentally different. It is a geological anomaly that requires an explanation far outside the context of the Fourth Dynasty. The stone remembers a sky that poured rain, a climate that turned this plateau into a watercourse. It is a memory etched into the very fabric of the monument, a silent contradiction to the arid desert we see today. There is a patience to stone. It does not argue or protest. It simply is. It holds the pressure of the earth, the memory of its own formation, and the scars of its long history on the surface. To stand in the Sphinx enclosure is to be surrounded by this quiet testimony. The air itself feels different here, heavier. The wind seems to fall silent as it spills over the edge, as if in deference to the story held in these walls. This is not a place for loud voices or quick conclusions. It is a place for observation, for allowing the sheer physical reality of the evidence to settle. The deep rolling grooves in the limestone are not a theory. They are a physical fact. They are as real as the stone itself, and they demand a reconciliation that the standard histories have never provided. They ask a question without using words. The established narrative is clear. The Giza complex is a product of the Old Kingdom, the Fourth Dynasty, around 2500 BCE. This was a civilization born of the desert, its rhythms dictated by the Nile's flood in an otherwise hyper-arid landscape. Their world was one of sun, sand, and stone. Their tools were copper and dolerite. Their power was manpower, and their cosmology was tied to the predictable cycles of their immediate environment. Yet, here in the heart of their most sacred site, is a geological signature that belongs to another world entirely. It points to a time when North Africa was not a desert, but a savanna, receiving monsoon rains. It speaks of the Neolithic subpluvial, a wet period that ended thousands of years before the first pharaoh is said to have existed. The evidence of the stone and the evidence of the history books are placed side by side, and they do not align. The researcher kneels, a gloved hand tracing the deep, rounded edge of one of the fissures. The surface is rough, pitted by the relentless action of water. Instruments are brought to bear, not to propose a theory, but simply to measure the depth, the curvature, the extent of the weathering. The work is slow, methodical, and quiet. It is the simple act of documenting what is there. Ground-penetrating radar reveals that these fissures extend deep below the current sand level, confirming they are not a recent phenomenon. The geologist's hammer taps against the enclosure wall, the sound sharp and clear in the dry air. The conclusion from this empirical work is always the same, returned with the cold, dispassionate certainty of physics. This is precipitation-induced erosion, formed over a vast timescale in a climate that has not existed in this region for nearly 10,000 years. This single, stubborn fact becomes a wedge, driven into the comfortable timeline of Egyptian history. It suggests the Sphinx and its enclosure are not a beginning, but an end. They are not the first monumental project of a new civilization, but perhaps the last remnant of a far older one. They were not born from the desert, but inherited by it. The pharaohs of the 4th dynasty, Khafra included, may not have been the original architects, but the first in a long line of restorers, patching and repairing a monument whose origins were already lost to them in the deep past. This possibility changes everything. It reframes the entire plateau not as a testament to the power of dynastic Egypt, but as a silent memorial to a forgotten chapter of human history, a chapter whose only surviving text is written in the language of erosion. The question then shifts. It is no longer simply about how these monuments were built, but when, and by whom. The water-worn stone of the enclosure wall pushes the origin point back, deep into the fog of prehistory, into a time from which we have no written records, no king lists, no administrative accounts. It suggests a civilization of immense capability existing thousands of years before Sumeria, before the first cities, before the accepted dawn of civilization itself. This is not a comfortable idea. It destabilizes the very structure of our understanding of the past. It introduces a profound discontinuity, a lost cycle of human endeavor whose greatest works survived, but whose memory was almost entirely erased by some great cataclysm or the simple, grinding passage of millennia. The silence from the historical record begins to feel less like an absence and more like a presence. This is the point of entry. It is a quiet disturbance in the official story, a detail that refuses to fit. It is the thread that, once pulled, begins to unravel the tapestry we have woven to explain this place. The implications are vast, but they must wait. For now, all that matters is the simple, observable fact of these water-worn stones and the question they pose. It is a question that challenges us to look again, to reconsider the evidence with fresh eyes, and to accept the possibility that the ground beneath our feet is far older than the story we have been told. The plateau holds its secrets tightly, but it does not hide them. It simply waits for the right questions to be asked, in the right tone of voice, with the patience to listen to the slow, silent answer of the stone. For those who have remained here, in this quiet space, feeling the weight of this first question, the journey has already begun. There is no need for maps or loud pronouncements. The shared silence is enough. It is an acknowledgement that we are standing at the edge of a great mystery, and that the path forward is not one of conquest, but of careful listening. We are not here to solve a puzzle, but to witness the memory held in the rock, to stand vigil with a past that is not truly past. The wind continues its low hum, and in the darkness, the great stones seem to settle deeper into the earth, holding their secrets for another night, waiting for those who are willing to stay and listen. The silence of the stone gives way to the silence of the archive. We move from the open air of the plateau to the still, heavy atmosphere of a library that holds the oldest thoughts of this land. Here, the evidence is no longer geological but textual, preserved on fragments of basalt, on brittle papyrus, and in the careful copies of scribes who lived millennia apart. Our guide is no longer the geologist, but the scribe himself, not as a person, but as a presence felt in the very structure of the records he kept. He was not a poet or a myth maker. He was an administrator, a keeper of lists, a man whose world was defined by order, measure, and the relentless cataloging of reality as he knew it. His work was not meant to inspire awe, but to maintain continuity. And it is in his methodical, almost sterile precision that we find the next deep fracture in the established timeline. We begin with a fragment of black basalt, known as the Palermo Stone. It is not a story. It is a royal annal, a year-by-year register of the reigns of the earliest kings of Egypt. For the dynastic rulers, the entries are mundane, meticulous. They record the height of the Nile inundation to the precise cubit, the religious festivals celebrated, the taxes collected, the creation of a new statue or the building of a temple. The tone is flat, bureaucratic, and utterly devoid of embellishment. It is a document of immense historical value precisely because of its dryness. It feels real. But as the scribe's chisel moves backward in time, past the familiar names of the First Dynasty, it continues into a section that official history has designated as myth. The tone, however, does not change. The stone lists a series of kings who ruled before Menes, the first human pharaoh. These are not described as gods in some ethereal realm, but are listed in the same annalistic format as their dynastic successors. They are presented simply as rulers of Upper and Lower Egypt. The scribe records their existence with the same administrative finality as he records the height of the flood. He is not telling a fable. He is continuing a list. He is transcribing an older record, one that spoke of a line of kings stretching into a past so deep it becomes unrecognizable to us. The stone is broken, much of the information lost, but what remains is a clear, unambiguous register of a long succession of rulers from a time before our history begins. We turn to another document, the Turin King List. This is not a monumental stone, but a fragile papyrus, shattered into more than 160 fragments, painstakingly reassembled by scholars. Like the Palermo stone, its purpose was administrative, likely a tax document. It is a list, column after column of kings' names and the precise duration of their reigns, down to the month and day. It is the work of a bureaucrat, a functionary of the state. The papyrus lists all the known rulers of Egypt, from the 19th dynasty all the way back to the beginning. And once again, as it passes the threshold of Menes, it does not stop. It continues, without any change in format or tone, into the register of the predecessors. The list records a dynasty of gods: Ptah, Ra, Geb, Osiris, Horus, who ruled for immense periods. The scribe notes their reigns with the same dispassionate accuracy as any other. After them, the list records the Shemsu Hor, the followers or companions of Horus. The papyrus states that this group of unnamed rulers reigned for 420 years. Following them is another group of reigns, lasting another 11 Soazerad years before the rise of Menes. The numbers are recorded with the same meticulous care as the tax records for a shipment of grain. There is no commentary, no explanation. It is simply the record. The impossible duration is presented as a simple administrative fact, copied from a source that the scribe clearly accepted as authoritative. One can almost feel the presence of the man who wrote this, his reed pen moving across the papyrus in the low light of an oil lamp. He is not inventing. He is copying. His task is to preserve the integrity of the list, to ensure the continuity of the record. The strangeness of the content does not seem to concern him. He is a conduit for information that was already ancient in his own time. The very structure of the document, its columns and rubrics, argues against it being a work of fiction. Myths are narratives, with drama and purpose. This is a ledger. It has the cold, unyielding quality of a spreadsheet, a tool of the state, whose purpose is to account for time itself. These are not isolated instances. In the 3rd century BCE, an Egyptian priest named Manetho was commissioned by the Greek ruler Ptolemy II to compile a complete history of his country. Manetho had access to the temple libraries, to records far more complete than the fragments that survive today. His work, the Egyptiaca, formed the very basis of modern Egyptology. It was he who grouped the pharaohs into the 30 dynasties we still use. He was a historian, a scholar, and like the scribes before him, when his history reached the period before the first dynasty, he did not record a void. He recorded what the ancient temple archives held. Manetho's history begins with a reign of gods, followed by a line of demigods, and then a final era ruled by the spirits of the dead, who correspond to the Shemsu-Hor. According to the surviving fragments of his work, these pre-dynastic reigns covered a period of more than 24,000 years. He presents this not as a poetic prelude, but as the first part of his chronological history. 3 distinct sources, separated by centuries, created for different purposes: a royal annal on stone, a tax list on papyrus, and a formal history for a foreign king, all independently attest to the same tradition. That the history of civilization in the Nile Valley was preceded by an immense period of organized rule stretching back tens of thousands of years. The repetition is unsettling. It is one thing to dismiss a single story as myth. It is another to find the same impossible data set recorded in the dry, administrative formats of a state bureaucracy, over and over again. The scribe's hand remains steady across the centuries. He records a reign of 300 years and a reign of 3,000 years, with the same script, the same ink, the same lack of comment. The sheer procedural normality of the record-keeping is what creates the profound sense of strangeness. It suggests we are not reading fiction, but rather the administrative residue of a history so old that its contents now appear impossible to us. Perhaps this is a moment to simply register the time. Note the hour on the clock, the quality of the light in the room. To mark this point in the reading of a record that seems to stand outside of time, it is a way of anchoring ourselves, of acknowledging that we are engaging with a framework that challenges our own sense of duration and history. This simple act of observation connects our present moment to the scribes, a shared ritual of marking time, even as the numbers themselves threaten to dissolve it into an incomprehensible deep past. The phenomenon is not confined to Egypt. We can, for a moment, shift our gaze eastward, to the dusty plains of Mesopotamia. There, another civilization was meticulously chronicling its own past. The Sumerian king list, inscribed on cuneiform tablets, serves the same function as its Egyptian counterparts. It is a sequential record of rulers and the lengths of their reigns, a document meant to establish historical and political continuity. It begins, like the Egyptian lists, in a remote antiquity that is difficult to reconcile with our own understanding of the past. The structure of the record is, once again, administrative and sober. The Sumerian list details the reigns of 8 kings who ruled from 5 cities before a great flood swept over the land. The scribe, working with a stylus on wet clay, records their reigns with methodical precision. Alulim ruled in Eridu for 28,800 years. Alalangar ruled for 36,000 years. Enmenlu-Ana of Bad Tibira ruled for 43,200 years. The numbers continue in this fashion, totaling 241, 200 years for the 8 kings. Then, the text states with stark simplicity, then the flood swept over. After the flood, the list resumes with kings whose reigns are shorter, more believable, gradually transitioning into the familiar timeline of recorded history. This is not a story of creation. It is not an epic poem. It is a king list, a political document, The scribe who pressed these wedges into clay was performing a bureaucratic function. Yet, he recorded these fantastic numbers as fact. Here again, we see the same pattern. A civilization's official records preserving the memory of an impossibly ancient era of kingship, an epic of immense duration that was brought to a sudden and catastrophic end by a great deluge. The parallel is too structural to be dismissed as mere coincidence. It points to a shared, deeply ancient memory, preserved not in myth, but in the most formal and official records of the world's first states. The detail is what disturbs. A myth might speak of a king who ruled for a very long time. An administrative record specifies a reign of 200 years. The precision feels out of place. It lends a strange and uncomfortable weight to the account. It is the precision of a clerk, not a poet. It suggests that these numbers were not invented for symbolic effect, but were transcribed from a source that presented them as data. The scribe, whether in Egypt or Sumer, was not tasked with making the past believable. He was tasked with making it survive. His duty was to the record itself, not to the sensibilities of a future audience. What are we to make of this? We are faced with a body of evidence that is internally consistent, cross-cultural, and recorded in the most sober and administrative formats available to the ancient world. Yet its content is, by our standards, impossible. The modern response is to categorize it all as myth, to assume these numbers are symbolic, to reinterpret them as something other than what they plainly state. But in doing so, we impose our own worldview upon the record. We assume the scribe was less rational than we are, that he did not understand the difference between a list and a story. The alternative is more challenging. It requires us to consider the possibility that the scribe knew exactly what he was writing down, that he was preserving a history that was handed down to him, a history of a world whose timeline operated on a scale we can no longer comprehend. It asks us to confront the cold, bureaucratic evidence for a past that should not exist, and to accept the profound discomfort that comes with it. The numbers sit there on the papyrus and the clay, silent, patient, and utterly indifferent to our disbelief. They are not asking for interpretation. They are simply waiting. The strangeness, then, comes from the dissonance between form and content. The form is bureaucratic, logical, and orderly. The content is fantastical, timeline-shattering, and seemingly impossible. When a civilization's most boring documents contain its most incredible stories, we are left with a fundamental problem. Are we misreading the nature of their administration, or are we misreading the nature of their history? The scribe offers no answer. He simply continues his work, copying the lists, preserving the numbers, his hand steady, his purpose unwavering, leaving a trail of cold, factual impossibilities for us to find in the dust. This is the foundation upon which the Giza mystery rests. Before we can even address the engineering of the stones, we must first confront the timeline recorded in the texts. The documents suggest that the civilization of the pharaohs did not emerge from a primitive void, but was heir to a legacy of immense antiquity. They were not a beginning, but a continuation. The king lists, with their impossible numbers, are perhaps the faint, administrative echo of that forgotten predecessor civilization, a world whose memory was preserved not in grand monuments, but in the dry, repetitive columns of a tax roll or a state chronicle. The true scale of the past may have been recorded, catalogued, and then, over millennia, simply forgotten. The physical record begins to speak, its voice colder and more direct than any papyrus. We are no longer in the archive, but in a climate-controlled vault, surrounded by the quiet hum of preservation systems. Here, under the stark, neutral light, lies a fragment of diorite, one of the hardest stones known to the ancient world. It is not an artifact meant for display. It is industrial waste, a core left behind by a hollow drill bit thousands of years ago. An archaeologist, their face obscured by shadow, runs a gloved finger over its surface. There is no inscription, no artistry. There is only a single, continuous spiral groove running the length of the core, a perfect helix etched into the stone. It is a machine signature. The groove tells a story of immense pressure and rotational speed. Microscopic analysis of the quartz crystals within the diorite reveals they were fractured by a force that is difficult to replicate, even today. The distance between the revolutions of the spiral, the feed rate of the drill, suggests it penetrated this incredibly hard material at a rate that would require a technology far more powerful than a hand-turned copper tube with sand as an abrasive. The evidence is not in what the object is, but in how it was made. It is the cold, physical fact of a tool mark that should not exist in the context of the Fourth Dynasty. The object rests on a velvet cloth, a piece of an industrial process from a forgotten age, its silence more profound than any king's tomb. This is not an isolated piece of evidence. The archaeologist moves to a large flat-screen monitor. On it are dozens of high-resolution photographs from sites across Egypt. A granite sarcophagus box from the Serapeum, its inner corners perfectly square. A broken lintel from a temple at Karnak, with a surface so flat it deviates by less than the thickness of a human hair over several feet. And everywhere, the same signature. The telltale sign of advanced machining. Saws that cut through basalt with impossible thinness and precision. Lathes that turned hard stone with a symmetry that defies hand tooling. The pattern begins to emerge from the scattered data points. This was not a single miraculous achievement on the Giza Plateau. It was a technological fingerprint, present across the entire landscape, on the hardest materials, a consistent signature of a lost science of stone. One sees the researcher in the field, standing within the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid. The air is still and heavy. The walls are not limestone, but rose granite, quarried and transported from Aswan, more than 500 miles to the south. The massive blocks, some weighing up to 70 tons, are fitted together with joints so fine a razor blade cannot be inserted between them. The work is not merely functional. It is a display of absolute mastery over a material that is notoriously difficult to work. The archaeologist's flashlight beam plays across the surface, revealing no chisel marks, only a smooth, almost polished finish. The question hangs in the silent air of the chamber. How was this accomplished with copper and stone tools? The official record, the scribe's meticulous accounts, offers no answer. The investigation shifts from the microscopic to the monumental. The tools are no longer calipers and microscopes, but theodolites and satellite data. The archaeologist is now a surveyor, standing on the bedrock at dawn, sighting the corners of the Great Pyramid against the horizon. The work is slow, a process of measuring angles and distances, of charting the structure's relationship to the Earth itself. The data is collected, processed, and a simple, stark fact emerges. The pyramid is aligned to the 4 cardinal points with an accuracy of within 3/60ths of a degree. This is a level of precision that would be a significant achievement for any modern architect with access to GPS and laser technology. For a civilization of the Bronze Age, it is a profound and unsettling anomaly. The pattern is not just terrestrial, it is celestial. The archaeologist now works at a desk, not in the field. The screen displays a star chart, the digital sky above Giza. The layout of the 3 great pyramids on the plateau is superimposed over the image. A connection, long noted by observers, becomes clear. The 3 structures on the ground form a pattern that mirrors the 3 stars in Orion's belt. The size of the pyramids corresponds to the brightness of the stars. Their slight offset from a straight line on the ground matches the slight offset of the stars in the sky. It is a map, a reflection of the heavens laid out in stone on a scale that is almost impossible to comprehend. The plateau is not just a necropolis, it is an astronomical instrument. This is a moment that requires a different kind of attention. For those who have followed the evidence this far, from the water-worn stone to the impossible numbers in the king lists, and now to the technological and astronomical patterns, a shared understanding begins to form. It is the recognition that we are not looking at a series of isolated mysteries, but at the coherent remnants of a single, vast design. Recognizing this pattern is not a conclusion, but an invitation to look deeper, to remain in the quiet space of observation. The story is not in any one piece of evidence, but in the resonance between them all, a chord struck across millennia that we are only now beginning to hear. The celestial alignment, however, contains a deeper, more challenging detail. The archaeologist adjusts the software, allowing the sky to move backward in time. Due to the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis, the constellations drift across the sky over a cycle of nearly 26 Ausosaran years. The star chart is rewound, century by century. The image of Orion's belt on the screen slowly separates from the Giza pyramids on the ground. The alignment is close in 2500 BCE, the supposed age of the pyramids, but it is not perfect. The researcher continues to move the clock of the heavens backward, deeper into the past. The numbers on the screen spin, moving past the dawn of Egypt, past the invention of writing, past the first cities of Sumeria. The stars continue their slow, precessional dance. Then, around the year 500 BCE, something happens. The movement stops. On the screen, the three stars of Orion's belt settle into a position in the sky that creates a perfect one-to-one correspondence with the three pyramids on the ground. The alignment is exact. The date is not arbitrary. It coincides, almost precisely, with the geological evidence for the end of the last great wet period in North Africa, the time when the rains fell that carved the fissures into the Sphinx enclosure. The two most profound anomalies of the plateau are locked together by a single point in deep time. The researcher leans back from the screen. The room is silent, save for the low hum of the computer. Two completely different lines of inquiry, one geological, based on water erosion, the other astronomical, based on the slow precession of the stars, have converged on the same impossible time frame. This is no longer a matter of a single strange artifact. It is a repeating signal, a pattern that echoes across disciplines. The stones of the enclosure wall and the stars in the sky are telling the same story, pointing to an origin point for the Giza master plan that predates the civilization said to have built it by 8,000 years. The pattern expands further. The location of the plateau itself becomes a part of the design. The archaeologist pulls up a global map. A line of longitude is drawn through the Great Pyramid. The structure sits at the center of the Earth's landmass, a point of geographical significance that seems too perfect to be an accident. Then, a measurement of its latitude is taken. The pyramid is located at 29.9792458 degrees north. The researcher types a number into a search bar. The speed of light in a vacuum, measured in meters per second, is 299,792,458. The correspondence is exact. The coordinates of the greatest monument on Earth appear to encode a fundamental constant of the universe. This detail is almost too much to hold. It feels like a rupture in reality, a piece of information that has no place in the ancient world. It is presented here not as a proven fact, but as a recorded observation, another data point in a pattern that grows stranger with each edition. The archaeologist verifies the numbers, checks the sources. The correlation remains. It is a layer of pure mathematics and physics, embedded in the very placement of the structure on the planet. It suggests the builders were not just master astronomers and engineers, but possessed a scientific knowledge that we have only rediscovered in the last century. The coldness of the numbers is what makes them so unsettling. We are forced to confront a convergence of impossibilities, a geological signature from a forgotten climate, an astronomical alignment from a prehistoric era, a recurring technological fingerprint of advanced machining. And now, a geodetic and physical constant encoded into the very location of the site. These are not interpretations or theories. They are the result of measurement and observation, of the simple methodical work of the researcher applying the tools of modern science to an ancient mystery. The evidence is not ambiguous. It is the conclusion it points to that is so difficult to accept. The archaeologist stands once more in the open air of the plateau, the wind picking up as evening approaches. The work of the day is done, the measuring, the cataloging, the comparing of data. But the mind cannot stop seeing the connections, the lines of force that link the ground to the sky, the erosion on the stone to the clockwork of the cosmos, the placement of the monument to the fundamental laws of nature. It is a coherent system, a message written in a language of science and time itself. The sheer intelligence of it is overwhelming, and it does not feel human, at least not in the way we understand the humans of the ancient world. The scope of the investigation has now irrevocably widened. It began with a single fissure in a limestone wall. It has expanded to encompass the entire planet and the movement of the stars. The Giza Plateau is no longer an isolated Egyptian project. It begins to feel like a global one, a marker left on a specific meridian, aligned to a specific moment in the great celestial cycle. The pattern suggests a purpose that transcends the burial of a single king. It speaks of a legacy, a transmission of knowledge designed to survive for tens of thousands of years, to be readable only by a civilization that had redeveloped the necessary science to understand it. The silence of the scribe now takes on a new weight. Perhaps he did not record the construction of the Great Pyramid because it was not built by his people. Perhaps he was, like the pharaohs he served, a curator of something left behind, a custodian of a sacred place whose origins were already lost in the mists of an antiquity so deep it was recorded only as a time when gods walked the earth. The documentary void is not a missing piece of the puzzle. It is the frame for the entire picture. It is the space in which this older story, the one told by the stone and the stars, can finally be seen. The sun sets, and the first stars appear in the darkening sky. Orion begins its slow ascent. The researcher watches, a small, solitary figure against the immense backdrop of the pyramids. The pattern is clear now, a web of connections that spans millennia. But recognizing a pattern is not the same as understanding it. It is merely the first step. The evidence has been gathered, the connections made. But the central question remains, now larger and more pressing than ever. Who were the architects of this grand design? And what message were they so desperate to preserve across the ages? The wind blows, carrying the dust of the plateau. It feels ancient, like the breath of the stone itself. The work of the archaeologist is to uncover facts, to lay them out in the clear light of reason. But some facts, when placed side by side, create a shadow, a presence that is felt but not seen. It is the shadow of the original builders, a rational and intelligent presence that can only be known by the sheer, undeniable power of their work. The investigation has led to this threshold, the point where the data gives way to a profound and unsettling silence. The silence of the predecessors. The records do not speak of gods in the way we have come to understand them. They speak of governors, of founders, of a preceding administration. The Palermo stone, the Turin king list, the Sumerian tablets, these are not hymns of praise. They are ledgers of succession. When the scribe's hand carves the name of a being like Ta or Ra, and assigns them a reign of several thousand years, he is not writing mythology. He is recording the first entry in a long chain of command, a transfer of power from one authority to another. These beings are not presented as ethereal spirits, but as the original holders of an office, the first name on a list of kings. Their function, as recorded, was foundational, to establish the very framework of civilization, to bring order from chaos, a process described with the dispassionate language of a state charter. Their role is consistently defined by action, not by essence. In the Memphite theology, the being known as Ptah is not simply a creator god who thinks the world into existence. He is described in functional terms: the master craftsman, the divine artisan, the one who gives form to ideas and structure to the land. The texts describe his work as designing, building, and organizing. Similarly, in the Sumerian records, the Anunnaki figure Enki is tasked with organizing the world, assigning destinies, and establishing order. He surveys the marshes, digs the rivers, and fills them with fish. He creates the brick mold and lays the foundations of cities. These are not acts of magic. They are described as immense feats of civil engineering, resource management, and societal planning, carried out with a logic and purpose that is entirely terrestrial. A persistent theme emerges from these disparate records, a common thread running through the foundational stories of both Egypt and Mesopotamia. It is the theme of instruction. Civilization, in these accounts, is not depicted as a slow, painful process of human discovery through trial and error. Instead, the core elements of organized society, agriculture, law, astronomy, architecture, writing, are described as complete systems handed down, a transfer of knowledge from these predecessor figures to a nascent humanity. They are portrayed as teachers, as instructors, as the bearers of a curriculum designed to elevate humanity to a new state of being. The transfer is presented as a deliberate, structured process, a curriculum for civilization itself, delivered by entities who had already mastered it. One must pause here. The weight of this implication needs a moment of stillness to be properly felt. The idea that our ascent was not a climb, but a lesson, that the first cities were not experiments, but applications of a received blueprint, that the first laws were not debated, but transcribed. This possibility alters the very foundation of our story. It suggests that for a time, humanity was in a state of tutelage, learning a system from instructors whose origins are recorded, but whose nature remains profoundly unknown. The silence in the room feels different when one considers that the past may not have been a simpler time, but a more educated one. We can give these figures the name the Sumerians used, the Anunnaki. The word itself is stripped of its modern connotations and examined with the cold precision of a linguist. It is often translated as those who from heaven to earth came. It is a descriptive term, not a mystical one. It denotes origin and direction, a statement of movement from one domain to another. The cuneiform texts do not treat them as a homogeneous group of deities. They are presented as a structured society with a clear hierarchy, with specific roles and responsibilities. They are a body politic, an expeditionary force, or a corporate entity with a defined mission on this planet. Their story, as recorded by the scribes, is one of labor, of political disputes, of resource allocation, and of long-term strategic planning. The structure of their administration is laid out with bureaucratic clarity. The texts speak of a council, of assignments, of jurisdictions. Enlil is the commander, the head of the mission, residing at his command center in Nippur. Enki, the chief scientist and engineer, is based in Eridu, the first city. Their roles are distinct and sometimes in conflict. Other figures are given specific domains. Inanna is in charge of a particular region. Nanna is responsible for the city of Ur. It is an organizational chart, a division of labor that speaks not of mythic archetypes, but of a functional, operational command structure. The scribe records their decrees and their territorial disputes with the same factual tone he uses for a grain receipt. Their primary function, the one that resonates most deeply with the evidence left in stone, was measurement. They are consistently depicted surveying the land, laying out boundaries, and establishing standards. The concept of decreeing the fates in Sumerian thought was not about mystical prophecy. It was about setting parameters, defining functions, and assigning roles within a grand, orderly system. This was project management on a planetary scale. The same intelligence that calculated the precise celestial alignments of the Giza pyramids seems to be described here in the texts as a fundamental attribute of their administration. They were surveyors of the cosmos and the earth, and their work was to embed that cosmic order into the terrestrial landscape. The air in the archive grows thin. The sheer logistical scope of such an undertaking is difficult to process. To think of the ancient world not as the cradle of nascent human effort, but as a territory under the administration of a foreign power, a project site being developed according to a pre-existing plan. The dust motes dancing in the single beam of light seem to trace the outlines of this invisible structure, a framework of order that was put in place long before the first human king was crowned. The wind outside seems to whisper of a world that was once managed, a planet that was once a work site. Returning to the Egyptian record, we find a parallel structure in a different vocabulary. The period after the reign of the great gods is filled by the Shem-Su-Hor, the followers of Horus. These are not described as gods, but as a transitional government, a bridge between the divine and the human. The Turin king list assigns them a collective reign of over 13 Suzerain years. This immense period can be understood not as a literal sequence of kings, but as the long duration of an apprenticeship. The Shem-Su-Hor were the first human initiates, the first generation of local administrators trained to maintain the system left behind by the original architects. They were the custodians of the knowledge, the keepers of the sacred sites, tasked with ensuring the continuity of the plan. This concept of a trained, initiated human elite is not unique to Egypt. In Mesopotamia, the texts speak of the Apkallu, 7 sages who lived before the flood. They are described as the advisors to the first kings, the bringers of civilization. The records state they were created by Enki to teach humanity the arts of law, architecture, and craft. They are often depicted wearing strange, fish-like cloaks, a detail the scribe records with his typical lack of commentary. Like the Shem-Su-Hor, their function was that of transmission. They were the living interface between the Anunnaki administration and the human population, the teachers in a planetary schoolhouse. The impossible longevity of these early rulers, both divine and human, can now be seen in a new light. Instead of dismissing the numbers as purely symbolic, we can consider them from a functional perspective. Within the logic of the records, this longevity served a purpose: stability. Long-term projects, like the establishment of a global astronomical grid or the construction of monuments designed to last for millennia, would require an administration with a continuity far beyond the human lifespan. The scribe, in recording these vast reigns, may have been preserving the memory of a time when the timescale of power was fundamentally different, when a single ruler could oversee a project for a period that we would consider an entire age of civilization. Then, in the middle of the Sumerian king list, after 8 kings have ruled for a total of 200 years, the scribe makes a stark, chilling entry. He writes 4 words that sever history in two. Then the flood swept over. There is no mythic elaboration, no dramatic telling of the event. It is recorded as a simple, administrative fact, the end of an era. The great cataclysm that appears in the myths of cultures all over the world is here presented as a line item in a ledger, a system reset. It was the end of the project, a catastrophic interruption that brought the entire pre-Diluvian world and its administration to a close. The silence that follows this entry in the text is profound. It is the silence of a world washed clean, of a memory almost entirely erased. It is the silence of the great antagonist, time in its most violent and absolute form. The flood was not just a geological event. It was a historical discontinuity, a severing of the link between the inheritors and the predecessors. What survived was fragmentary. A handful of texts, a few sacred sites, and a deep, wounded memory of a time when the world was different, when it was governed by another power. After this break, the record resumes. The scribe writes, After the flood had swept over, kingship was lowered again from heaven. The system is re-established, but it is a shadow of its former self. The new kings, the human rulers of the historical era, have much shorter lifespans. The knowledge is incomplete. The new civilizations of Sumer and Egypt seem to arise with a sudden, unexplained sophistication, as if they were built upon the ghost of a former template. They are not starting from scratch. They are attempting to rebuild a system whose original blueprints have been lost. The others recede from the narrative. They are no longer present as an active administration. Their names become the names of gods. Their actions become the substance of myth. Their science becomes the basis for priestly ritual. The functional reality of their presence fades, replaced by a religious interpretation. The scribe, in his later chronicles, faithfully records this transformation. He does not distinguish between the administrator Enlil and the god Enlil. He simply records what the tradition of his time holds to be true. The memory of the system was preserved, but its operational meaning was forgotten. And so we are left with Giza. The plateau can now be seen as the most enduring physical artifact of this lost administration. It is a piece of hardware, a vast and complex instrument whose function we no longer understand because we have lost the knowledge of the system it was built to serve. The silence of the Egyptian scribes regarding its construction is not an oversight. It is the honest silence of a people who were 1,000 years removed from its true builders. They were the faithful custodians of a sacred place, the inheritors of a profound legacy, but the architects themselves belong to a previous cycle of time, to the world that existed before the great flood swept everything away. The work of the archaeologist is to read the layers of the earth, to see time compressed into strata of sand, soil, and debris. Each layer is a sentence in a long and patient story. But here, on the Giza Plateau, and in the documented history of this land, the most profound statements are made by the pages that have been torn out. The investigation turns from the analysis of what is present to the study of what is absent. We now confront the great, silent antagonist of this story. The void itself, the structured and recurring silence that lies between the layers of what we know. This silence is not an empty space. It is an active presence, a shadow that gives the surviving evidence its true and unsettling shape. It suggests that the history of this place is not a continuous line, but a series of brilliant fragments separated by deep, unfathomable chasms of lost time. Consider the ground beneath the foundations of the Old Kingdom temples. The archaeologist's trowel scrapes away the familiar strata of the Fourth Dynasty, the pottery shards, the remnants of workers' settlements, the dust of a known civilization. Below this, there should be the accumulated layers of the preceding cultures, the slow, gradual buildup of the early dynastic and late pre-dynastic periods, a clear and traceable line of development showing the evolution of skill and society. Instead, in many key locations around the great monuments, the record is thin, almost non-existent. The sophisticated culture of the Pyramid Age seems to spring into existence with no clear developmental ancestry beneath it. It is an archaeological rupture, a sudden leap in complexity and scale that lacks a local evolutionary prequel. The layers simply are not there. One can stand in a trench cut into the bedrock of the plateau and feel this temporal break. The air itself seems to carry the weight of this missing time. Above is the evidence of a civilization at its absolute zenith, capable of engineering on a planetary scale. Below is the bedrock, marked and scarred by forces far older than any pharaoh. But the transitional steps, the crucial chapters that should connect the primitive to the sublime, are absent. It feels like watching a great tree that has its highest branches fully formed, but is missing the lower third of its trunk. The wind blows the sand into these excavated pits, as if trying to fill a void that geology itself cannot explain, a silence that is measured not in years, but in missing epochs. This absence is not merely a sign of poor preservation, It is a structural problem that haunts the very foundations of Egyptology. The sudden appearance of a fully formed hieroglyphic system, a complex theology, and an unparalleled mastery of stonecraft suggests that the dynastic Egyptians did not invent these things from scratch. It implies they were the inheritors of a system that had already been developed elsewhere, or in a previous time from which the direct archaeological record has been severed. The silence between the layers is the negative space that outlines a lost genesis. It forces us to consider that the Old Kingdom was not a beginning, but a renaissance, a powerful and brilliant attempt to reignite a flame whose original source had long since been extinguished. The focus shifts from the earth to the archive, from the missing strata of soil to the missing scrolls of papyrus. The scribe, that meticulous and ever-present administrator, recorded everything. We have his records for grain shipments, for the quarrying of stone for lesser tombs, for the casting of copper tools, for the payment of workers in bread and beer. His world is one of lists, of inventories, of ledgers. He was the memory of the state, and his duty was to account for every aspect of its function. Yet, when we search his vast and detailed archives for the central project of his age, the construction of the Great Pyramid, we find a void of staggering proportions. There are no blueprints, no engineering diagrams, no project plans, no logistical accounts that match the scale of the undertaking. This documentary void is the most profound contradiction in the historical record. It is inconceivable that a state bureaucracy as sophisticated as that of the Fourth Dynasty, a system that tracked every jar of oil, would fail to document its single greatest achievement. To build the Great Pyramid would have been the largest logistical, economic, and human endeavor of its time, an effort requiring decades of meticulous planning and resource management. The scribe, who recorded the reign of Khufu in such detail, remains silent on the one thing that would define his king for all eternity. This is not a lost document. It is a missing library. It is an administrative black hole at the very center of the official history. We must imagine the royal library at Memphis or Heliopolis, the quiet halls, the ordered stacks of papyrus scrolls, each one a thread in the fabric of the state. The scribe moves between them, his task to maintain this fabric, to ensure its continuity. And yet, on the shelf where the records for the Giza project should reside, there is only dust. The absence is so complete, so total, that it ceases to feel accidental. It begins to feel like a deliberate act of omission, or more unsettlingly, an acknowledgement that these records never existed because the work was not of the scribe's time. The silence is not a failure of record-keeping. It is a testament to an inheritance, a confession written in invisible ink that the knowledge of Giza's construction was not theirs to record. The implication of this dual silence, the archaeological and the administrative, is immense. It suggests that the entire edifice of the Old Kingdom was built upon a forgotten foundation. The pharaohs and their scribes were not the authors of this story, but its editors, writing their own chapter over a text whose beginning was already lost to them. The antagonist is not a person or an event, but the process of erasure itself. It is the Great Forgetting, a slow and silent cataclysm that severed a civilization from its own origins, leaving it in possession of a profound technology it could use, but could no longer explain. The monuments stand as evidence of the knowledge, while the silence in the records stands as evidence of the amnesia. This is the point in the vigil where the silence becomes a participant. It is no longer just a backdrop, but a presence in the room, a weight upon the air. It is the voice of the invisible antagonist, speaking in a language of gaps and omissions. To truly understand this story, one must learn to listen not to the words that were written, but to the spaces between them, to the pauses that hold the deeper truth. The true history of this place is a ghost, and it can only be seen by observing the shape of the void it has left behind. The evidence of its existence is the scale of its own erasure. Perhaps this is a moment to join the scribe in his ritual. To mark this interval, In the space provided by this platform where comments are usually left, consider recording not an opinion or a fact, but a simple observation of the present silence. Note the time, the quiet in your own room, the feeling of this specific pause in the narrative. By doing so, you participate in the vigil, acknowledging the presence of the gap, the weight of the missing record. It is a small act of bearing witness to the great forgetting, a way of holding the space for a history that has been lost, but is not yet gone. The pattern of erasure is not limited to a single dynasty or a single site. It is a recurring feature of the ancient record, a pulse of loss that beats throughout deep history. The transition from the world before the Great Flood to the world after is the ultimate expression of this discontinuity. The Sumerian king list does not describe a gradual recovery. It states that kingship was lowered again from heaven. This is not the language of continuity. It is the language of a system reboot, of a new installation on a hard drive that has been wiped clean. The knowledge and longevity of the pre-Diluvian rulers are gone, replaced by a more fragile, more human order. The greatest silence of all is the one that falls across the face of the waters, the silence of a world that has been washed away. This sense of a severed past is what makes the sudden rise of civilizations like Sumer and Egypt so profoundly mysterious. They appear on the world stage with a startling and inexplicable maturity. Within a few short centuries, they possess sophisticated writing, complex mathematics, monumental architecture, and organized state religions. There is no long, slow climb from primitive beginnings. It is a sudden explosion of culture and knowledge, as if a seed that had gestated for millennia in the dark suddenly burst into full flower. This sudden civilization phenomenon is a direct consequence of the great silence that precedes it. We do not see the roots because the soil that held them has been washed away. In the quiet halls of a museum, the evidence of this rupture is tangible. One can look at the crude, almost childlike pottery of a pre-dynastic culture in one display case. And then, in the very next, separated by a seemingly short span of time, one sees the perfectly carved stone vessels of the early dynastic period. These are not simple pots. They are works of impossible craftsmanship, carved from the hardest stones like diorite and granite, with slender necks and hollowed-out interiors, created with a technology that we still struggle to explain. The leap is not evolutionary. It is revolutionary. It is the work of a hand that has suddenly remembered a lost art, a sudden influx of a knowledge that has no clear local origin. The silence between these two display cases is louder than any historical text. The history we have, then, is a palimpsest. It is a manuscript that has been scraped clean and written over, but the faint traces of the original text still remain, visible to those who know how to look. The stories of gods and long-reigning kings, the impossible precision of the stonework, the celestial alignments, these are the ghostly letters of a previous story, showing through the later script of dynastic history. The scribe, in his meticulous copying, preserved these fragments without fully understanding them. He was a curator of a broken narrative, faithfully transcribing the parts of the story that had survived the great erasure, his work a bridge across the chasm of the forgotten. The Turin king list itself is a perfect metaphor for this condition. It is not a complete scroll, but a collection of brittle fragments, painstakingly reassembled. The scribe's neat columns are broken, his lists of kings interrupted by gaps where the papyrus has crumbled to dust. Looking at the reassembled document is like looking at the structure of ancient history itself. Brilliant pieces of preserved information surrounded by a great and frustrating emptiness. The reigns of gods and demigods are there, recorded with administrative precision. But the context, the narrative that would explain them, is lost in the lacunae. The document is a physical embodiment of the silent antagonist, its very brokenness a testament to the fragility of memory. This feeling of a fragmented inheritance is perhaps the source of the profound melancholy that haunts these ancient places. It is the feeling of standing in a great library where all but a few of the books have been burned. The remaining volumes are masterpieces, but they constantly refer to a body of knowledge that is no longer there. The Great Pyramid is a final chapter without a beginning, a conclusion to a story we cannot read. The silence is not one of peace, but of profound and unresolved loss. It is the silence of a question that has been echoing through the millennia, a question whose answer was lost in the great forgetting. We are left in this space, surrounded by the evidence of a profound and intelligent presence, and the equally profound evidence of its disappearance. The antagonist has done its work. Time, cataclysm, and the slow decay of memory have created a veil that is almost impenetrable. The silence between the layers is the final and most challenging piece of evidence. It demands that we stop looking for more artifacts and start contemplating the meaning of the void itself. It is in this emptiness that the true scale of the mystery resides, a scale that suggests the story of this planet is far older, far stranger, and far more broken than we have ever been willing to admit. The wind that blows across the Giza Plateau seems to carry this silence within it. It is a wind that has traveled over the dunes for 10,000 years, a witness to the slow erasure of a world. It fills the empty chambers of the pyramids and whispers through the broken columns of the temples. It is the breath of the great void, the sound of the antagonist who has almost won. But the stones remain. The alignments hold. The impossible artifacts endure. They are the last words of a forgotten language, waiting for a generation of translators who are willing to listen, not just to the words, but to the immense and meaningful silence that surrounds them. The threads now begin to draw together. We have followed the path of water on stone, a geological memory of a world drowned in rain. We have traced the slow, celestial clockwork of the stars, an astronomical alignment pointing to a forgotten epoch. We have touched the cold, machined surfaces of granite and diorite, a technological fingerprint that feels alien to its supposed time. And we have listened to the most profound evidence of all, the structured administrative silence of the scribe, a void where the most important records should be. These are not separate mysteries to be solved in isolation. They are facets of a single, coherent phenomenon. They are harmonics of a single, resonant frequency that has been echoing from the bedrock of the plateau for more than 12,000 years, a signal that speaks in the unified language of geology, astronomy, mathematics, and a profound, intentional absence. This coherence implies a singular, unifying intelligence. The patterns are too precise, too interconnected, too technically demanding to be the product of accident or the slow, iterative evolution of a primitive culture. What we are witnessing is not a collection of artifacts, but the components of a system. The entire Giza Plateau, in this light, ceases to be a necropolis, a city of the dead for the burial of kings. It becomes something else entirely, a vast and complex instrument, a piece of functional hardware engineered on a scale that beggars the imagination. The placement of each structure, the choice of materials, the celestial and geodetic alignments, all of these elements appear to be deliberate, integrated parts of a master plan, a design of such scope and foresight that it treats the planet itself as its drawing board. Let us stand back, in the cool night air, and simply observe the result of this plan. See the three great masses on the horizon, their stark geometry a deliberate counterpoint to the natural landscape. They are not merely sitting on the plateau, they are anchored to it, their foundations reaching down into the living rock. The Sphinx nearby is not an addition, but a subtraction, a form revealed by carving away the earth around it. The entire complex feels less like it was built, and more like it was deployed. It is a presence that reorders the space around it, a silent engine whose purpose is unknown, but whose design speaks of an intelligence that was methodical, patient, and possessed of a perspective that measured time not in human lifespans, but in the great, slow cycles of the cosmos. If the plan is unified, then its timeline must also be unified. The convergence of the geological and astronomical evidence on a single point in deep time, circa 500 BCE, can no longer be dismissed as coincidence. It must be considered the primary temporal marker, the true date of the design. This act of redating is not a minor adjustment to the historical record. It is a fundamental rupture. It places the intellectual genesis of the Giza complex into a world we do not know, a time from which we have no cities, no writing, no kings. It posits the existence of a high civilization in the deepest twilight of the last ice age, a civilization that possessed a scientific and engineering capability that would not be seen again on this planet for another 12 millennia. This is the central, unsettling implication that rises from the integrated evidence. The architects of this design, the predecessors, are therefore a logical necessity. They are the ghost in the machine, the unseen hand that the data requires. The ancient texts, with their sober accounts of the reigns of gods and the work of the Anunnaki, may not be myth at all, but the fragmented administrative memory of this founding intelligence. The records describe their function in precisely the terms that the Giza hardware demonstrates. They were surveyors, planners, and master builders who established the foundations of order. They were not beings of faith, but of function. The evidence on the ground and the evidence in the texts begin to mirror one another, describing a world that was, for a time, under the direct and rational administration of this profoundly ancient and non-human authority. A pause is required here, a moment to let the sheer chronological vertigo of this idea settle, to contemplate a history that begins not with the first tentative steps out of caves, but with a fully realized scientific and engineering tradition already in place, a tradition so ancient that its greatest works were already weathered ruins by the time the first pharaoh came to power. This reframes the whole of human history as a post-cataclysmic event, a long and difficult period of recovery in the shadow of a forgotten golden age. The silence from the deep past is not the silence of an empty world, but the silence of a world that has been lost, a silence filled with the ghosts of a competence we are only now beginning to match. This deep timeline provides, for the first time, a rational explanation for the great forgetting. The silence of the scribe is no longer a puzzle. It is the honest record of a broken inheritance. The dynastic Egyptians were not hiding the blueprints for the Great Pyramid. They simply did not possess them. They were the brilliant and pious custodians of a sacred inheritance, a legacy whose scientific and historical context had been severed by a cataclysm of unimaginable scale. The event we call the Great Flood, recorded as a simple line item by the Sumerian scribe, was the great discontinuity. It was the event that wiped the memory of the architects from the conscious record of humanity, leaving only their most durable works and the faint, garbled echo of their administration in the king lists. The scope of the plan, however, appears to have been greater than just the Nile Valley. The details encoded within the Great Pyramid, its location at the precise center of the Earth's landmass, its latitude matching the digits of the speed of light, suggest a planetary perspective. This was not a monument to a local king. It was a geodetic marker for the entire world. The intelligence that designed Giza was thinking on a global scale, using a universal language of mathematics and physics. This single piece of evidence elevates the entire mystery beyond the confines of archaeology and into a question about the history of the planet itself. It suggests that Giza may be only one component in a global system, a single node in a network of forgotten design, its purpose tied to the very orbital and physical constants of the Earth. Imagine the planet turning in the silent darkness of space, a sphere of blue, white, and brown, and on its surface a single, specific location, marked by a geometry so precise it is visible from orbit, a marker that establishes a prime meridian and encodes a fundamental law of the universe in its very coordinates. This is what the evidence implies the Giza Plateau truly is. It is not a monument pointing up to the heavens in praise. It is a monument that pins the heavens to the earth, a point of calibration, a functional piece of planetary engineering. The quiet hum in the king's chamber might not be an echo, but the faint, residual resonance of a machine that is still, in some way, operational, its purpose waiting to be rediscovered. If Giza is a machine, or a message, then its function is to preserve and transmit information across vast spans of time. The durability of its construction, the universality of its mathematical language, and its alignment to the slow precessional clock all point to a single purpose: to survive a complete cycle of cataclysm and forgetting, and to be decipherable only by a future civilization that had redeveloped the necessary scientific literacy. The message was not intended for the people of the Bronze Age or the Iron Age. The language it is written in, the language of geodesy, advanced astronomy, and physics, is a language that only we, in the last few centuries, have begun to learn to speak again. The chilling implication is that the intended recipient of the Giza message is us. We are the children of the survivors, the inheritors of a planet that was once home to a civilization of profound knowledge and power. And for 12,000 years, their most profound statement has stood silent in the desert, waiting for someone to arrive who could read the language of its design. The convergence of evidence is not an academic puzzle. It is the slow, dawning realization that we may have finally reached the technological and intellectual moment for which the message was intended. We are standing at the threshold of a dialogue that has been waiting to happen for more than 400 generations, a dialogue with a past that is far more intelligent and mysterious than we ever believed possible. To follow this story is to accept a place within it. The path forward is not about finding a single simple answer, but about learning to ask a much larger question. For those who choose to continue this vigil, know that you are not alone. The listening continues, and the signal, faint as it is, grows clearer with each piece of evidence we place in its proper context. This is not the end of an investigation, but the beginning of a remembrance. The implication then expands to touch everything. The entire narrative of human civilization, our sudden and inexplicable rise, our recurring myths of a lost golden age, our deep, instinctual fear of cosmic cycles and world-ending floods, all of it may be the long, unfolding consequence of this single, foundational event. We are not a species that created civilization from nothing. We are a species that is recovering from a profound, planet-wide amnesia, and the clues to our own forgotten past were left for us, written in a language of stone and stars, a legacy of a history that belongs not just to a single nation, but to the entire human race. The question that has driven us this far, who built the pyramids, dissolves, replaced by a set of questions far more profound. What kind of event could have been so devastating that it could shatter a global, scientifically advanced civilization, leaving almost no trace of itself except for a few impossibly durable monuments? What does it mean to live in the second iteration of human civilization, to be the inheritors of a broken cycle? And what was the purpose of the message itself? Was it a warning, a legacy of knowledge, or simply a tombstone, a final defiant statement from a world that knew it was about to die? We pull back from this conceptual edge, back to the physical reality of the plateau. The wind continues its ceaseless work, moving the sand, polishing the stone, indifferent to the questions that trouble the human mind. The great monuments hold their silence. They have carried this weight for millennia. They have watched civilizations rise and fall, languages born and forgotten, stars shift in the sky. They do not offer answers. They simply remain, a permanent and physical embodiment of the question itself, a challenge to the smallness of our own recorded history. Their presence is a constant, quiet reminder that the ground beneath our feet is older and stranger than we know. The final image begins to form, seen not from the ground but from a great height. The Giza complex, a small, perfect geometric pattern on the vast curved surface of the Earth. It is aligned not to the local river or the immediate horizon, but to the cardinal directions of the planet and the distant light of Orion. From this perspective, it is clear that it is not an Egyptian artifact. It is a piece of planetary architecture, a quiet, waiting instrument, its purpose still locked away, its signal still transmitting into the long night of our forgetting, waiting for the moment of our awakening. The night deepens on the plateau. The work of connecting the lines, of drawing the grand, unsettling pattern across the sky and the earth, is done. The mind, stretched to its limit, now seeks stillness. The air grows colder, thinner. The distant lights of the city feel a world away, a different century. Here, in the presence of these immense and silent forms, the only time that seems to matter is the slow turning of the earth and the patient movement of the stars. The great intellectual effort of the investigation gives way to a simpler, more profound state, that of the vigil. We are no longer searching for clues, but have become quiet witnesses to a presence that has endured for ages, a presence that asks for nothing but our stillness. We return to the stone itself, the first and final witness. A hand, now bare, can be placed against the cool, weathered flank of a megalith. The surface is not smooth. It is a landscape of its own, pitted and scarred by 10,000 years of wind and dust, and before that, by the rain. To touch it is to touch a timeline, to feel the immense, slow friction of history. The questions that seem so vast and abstract, of celestial mechanics and forgotten civilizations, become grounded in this simple, physical contact. The stone does not offer answers. It offers only its own unyielding reality, a permanence that stands in silent judgment of our fleeting certainties and our brief, noisy histories. It was here before us. It will be here long after we are gone. The wind never truly stops here. It is the one constant sound, the one eternal voice of this landscape. It is the sound of erasure, the patient, grinding work of the great antagonist. Each grain of sand it carries is a tool, slowly wearing down the sharp edges of the past, blurring the inscriptions, filling the hollows. Tonight, it seems to carry something more than dust. It carries the weight of the long silence, the echo of the missing record. It whispers through the empty chambers and across the bare rock, not telling a story, but embodying the very process by which the story was lost. To listen to the wind on the Giza Plateau is to hear the sound of the great forgetting, a low and constant hum that has been the only music here for millennia. The instruments are packed away. The theodolite is folded into its case, its precise lenses shielded from the night. The geologist's hammer is silent. The laptops are closed, their screens dark. The work of the researcher, the archaeologist, the surveyor is finished for the day, and perhaps, for the purpose of this story, forever. What remains cannot be measured by any tool. It is the pattern left behind in the mind, the ghost of the data. The human link to this mystery now steps back, becoming a small, solitary figure walking away from the monuments, their shadow long in the moonlight. The investigation recedes, leaving only the object of its inquiry to stand alone against the sky, its secrets intact, its presence undiminished by our attempts to comprehend it. In a climate-controlled vault, miles away and a world apart, the fragments of the Turin King list rest in their sterile display. The scribe's hand is still visible in the neat columns, the precise formation of the hieratic script. We have seen his work as a source of profound contradiction, his silence a key to the mystery. But now, in this final quiet, we can see him differently. He was not a gatekeeper, but a bridge. He worked against the great forgetting, preserving the broken pieces of a memory far older than his own civilization. He did not understand the numbers he was copying, the reigns of gods and the impossible durations, but he believed the record was important. His work was an act of faith in a history he could no longer read, a final, desperate attempt to pass along a message whose meaning was already lost to him. The questions we began with have not been answered. They have been dismantled. Who built the pyramids? And how? Seem now like the questions of a child, too small for the scale of the subject. The investigation has not led us to a conclusion, but to a state of profound and informed wonder. The new questions are deeper, more resonant. What is the true, cyclical nature of time on this planet? What is the purpose of a memory that can be held in stone but lost to the minds of an entire species? And what does it mean to be the inheritors of a message we have only just begun to realize was left for us? The mystery of Giza is not a problem to be solved, but a context to be lived in. Perhaps memory is not a line, but a field. A landscape that can be buried, fallowed, and then, after a long winter, rediscovered. What has happened here is not an explanation. It is an act of remembrance. The evidence, when pieced together, does not form a theory. It forms a faint image, a ghost of a world that we have always felt, in our deepest myths and our most unsettling dreams, was there. The feeling that we are not the first, the sense that our history is a story that begins in the middle. The work of this vigil has been to clear away some of the dust that has settled on that memory, to let the faint light of a forgotten dawn shine through the cracks in our own, much younger story. Look up. The stars are cold and clear in the desert sky. They are the same stars that shone on the architects as they sighted their alignments. They are the same stars that were reflected in the waters of the Great Flood. They are the same stars the scribe watched as he copied his impossible lists. They are the only unbroken thread, the only witnesses who have seen the entire story from its beginning to this present moment. They hold the complete record. The patterns we see on the ground are a single frozen moment of their long dance, a snapshot of the heavens from a time when the world beneath them was entirely different. They are the ultimate archive, silent, perfect, and indifferent. And so the plateau returns to its original state. A waiting room. It is a place between worlds, between the known and the unknowable, between a past that is lost and a future that has not yet arrived. It has held its position, maintained its alignments, and preserved its secrets through the rise and fall of empires, through the slow drift of the continents, through the long, patient turning of the precessional clock. It has waited for a species to evolve, or to re-evolve, to a point where it could once again read the universal language of mathematics, physics, and astronomy. It has waited for us. The silence here is not empty. It is expectant. The story now passes from the voice of the narrator to the quiet contemplation of the witness. The journey we have taken together, through the evidence of stone and star, and the silence of the archive, ends here. But the vigil continues. It continues in the mind of anyone who has followed this path and felt the weight of the great question. The responsibility is no longer to listen to a narrative, but to hold the silence that follows it, to stand, metaphorically, on this plateau and feel the immensity of what is not known. The story does not belong to the teller. It belongs to the one who remains to watch the sky after the tale is told. There can be no final answer, because any answer would be an enclosure, a wall built around a mystery that is meant to remain open. To name the architects, to define their purpose, to explain away the strangeness, would be to diminish the very thing that makes this place sacred. Its power is not in what it is, but in what it asks of us. It is a permanent and physical monument to the humility of human knowledge. It is the great stone question mark at the heart of our history. It stands to remind us that our memory is short, our story is incomplete, and the universe is far older and stranger than our records have ever admitted. The camera finds a single, final image. The moonlight catches the edge of a massive granite block. A gust of wind stirs the sand at its base, and a few fine grains trickle down its weathered face, a tiny silent waterfall of moments. Each grain is a year, a century, a millennium, falling into the great accumulation of the forgotten. The sound is almost imperceptible, the softest whisper. The sound of time itself. It is the only movement in a landscape of profound stillness. It is the final, quiet word of the antagonist and the patient, enduring reply of the stone. The wind blows. The sand shifts. The stones hold their ground. They have kept this vigil for more than 12,000 years. They will keep it for thousands more. They are a promise, made in a language we are only just beginning to remember, that nothing is ever truly lost. It is only waiting. Waiting for a moment of quiet. Waiting for a clear night. Waiting for the right questions to be asked. Not in a loud voice of certainty, but in a whisper of genuine and patient wonder. The silence that remains is not an ending. It is the space where the real listening begins. The great dark wheel of the sky turns above the plateau. Orion continues its slow climb. The three great pyramids hold their alignment, their peaks aimed at the heart of the constellation. They are a clock whose hands move too slowly for a human life to perceive. They are a memory held in the earth. And as the night wears on, they continue their silent, patient watch over a world that has forgotten it is being watched.